It was March 17, 1969, and Elvis Presley was sitting in seat 2A on a commercial flight from Los Angeles to Memphis, doing something that was becoming increasingly uncommon for a man of his level of fame, which was flying alongside regular everyday people rather than on a private aircraft. Elvis had always had a genuine appreciation for the grounding feeling of being just another passenger among strangers, and first class gave him enough space and privacy to make it work. By this point in his life, he had every reason to feel good about where things were headed. His 1968 comeback television special had been an enormous success, reminding the entire country exactly why he had earned the title people gave him, and he was riding that renewed energy and focus as he headed home to Memphis to visit his father and begin planning his long-awaited return to performing live in front of audiences. The flight had been completely routine for the first 90 minutes. Elvis was reading a book, occasionally looking out the window at the clouds far below. The plane carried about 80 passengers, a cross-section of ordinary American life in 1969, families on their way home, businessmen in suits, a handful of college students. Nobody had made a fuss about recognizing Elvis, or if they had noticed him, they were being politely discreet about it. Then, without any warning at all, something changed. There was a sound, not a dramatic explosion or anything that would make sense in a movie, just a grinding, stuttering, deeply wrong noise that came from the left side of the aircraft. Elvis felt the plane shudder beneath him. He felt the rhythm of the engines shift in a way that told him immediately, even without any aviation knowledge, that something had just gone seriously wrong. The aircraft lurched just enough to send drinks spilling and rattle the overhead storage bins. The familiar steady hum of the engines changed pitch, and Elvis felt his stomach sink as the plane began losing altitude. For just a moment after that, everything went strangely quiet, and passengers exchanged those uncertain sideways glances that people share when they are trying to figure out whether they are allowed to be frightened yet. Then the intercom came on. The pilot identified himself as Captain Morrison, and even through the speaker his voice betrayed him. He was trying hard to sound steady and in control, but the tightness was there. He told the passengers they had experienced a failure in the port engine, that the plane was losing altitude, and that everyone needed to return to their seats immediately while the flight attendants prepared for emergency procedures. The cabin did not erupt into screaming right away, but there was that sudden collective gasp that comes just before panic takes hold, and then it started spreading. A woman across the aisle from Elvis began crying. A man seated behind him was praying out loud. Somewhere toward the back of the plane a child started wailing. Elvis felt his own heartbeat accelerate sharply and felt fear settle into his chest as a cold and physical presence. They were at 30,000 feet. One engine had failed. The aircraft was going down. Those were the facts, and none of them were reassuring. But as Elvis took in the scene around him, watching fear spread rapidly through the cabin from one face to the next, something inside him shifted. The fear did not go away, it was absolutely still there, but it got pushed aside by something stronger, a powerful need to get up and do something useful rather than sit and watch everything fall apart around him. A flight attendant rushed past him looking pale and clearly rattled, and Elvis reached out and gently took hold of her arm. He asked her quietly how bad it really was. She looked at him and recognition crossed her face. She told him they had one working engine and that the plane could land on one engine, that it was designed to do exactly that. But then she lowered her voice and told him something that concerned her more in that moment. She said the captain was young and that this was his first real in-flight emergency and that he was scared. Elvis understood the weight of that immediately. A frightened pilot in a crisis was its own serious problem on top of everything else. He asked her if she could get him into the cockpit. She told him she could not do that. He told her he was not going to interfere with anything, that he just thought he might be able to help, and he asked her to trust him. Something in the way he said it reached her, and she nodded and led him forward. The cockpit door was already open, which was required under emergency protocols, and through the opening Elvis could see both pilots working urgently over the instrument panels. Captain Morrison had both hands locked on the controls, his knuckles drained of color. The co-pilot was going through an emergency checklist with a voice that was audibly shaking as he read each item. Elvis spoke from the doorway and said the captain's name. Morrison told him without turning around that he did not have time. Elvis said he understood that, but that he had an idea and he needed 30 seconds. He explained that the passengers were beginning to panic badly, and that if that panic got out of hand, if people started getting out of their seats or grabbing luggage or failing to follow the crew's instructions when it came time to land, the situation could result in people getting hurt in ways that had nothing to do with the engine. Morrison snapped back that he could not focus on the passengers right now because he was trying to keep the aircraft in the air, and Elvis heard the edge of something close to panic creeping into the pilot's voice. Elvis kept his own voice completely level and told Morrison he was doing the right things and doing them well, but that the co-pilot could continue monitoring the instruments and systems while Elvis used the cockpit microphone to talk to the passengers and try to bring the level of fear down so that Morrison could focus entirely on flying. The co-pilot and Morrison looked at each other. Through the open cockpit door they could hear the sounds from the cabin getting worse. Someone back there had started screaming. The flight attendants were doing everything they could, but they were clearly overwhelmed by the scale of what was happening. Morrison gave in and pointed at the microphone and told Elvis to make it fast because they had roughly 10 minutes before they needed to begin their emergency descent toward a landing strip. Elvis stepped into the cockpit, picked up the microphone, pulled in a long slow breath, forced his own fear as far down as it would go, and spoke. He told the passengers his name. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Elvis Presley." His voice came through every speaker in the cabin with that familiar warmth and steadiness that tens of millions of people had been listening to for over a decade. The effect was almost immediate. The noise in the cabin dropped sharply. People who had been mid-panic stopped and went still, because what they were hearing simply did not compute with what they had expected to hear, and the surprise of it broke through the fear just long enough to get their attention. Elvis told them he knew they were scared, and then he told them something that mattered even more, which was that he was scared too. He did not pretend to be calm because he had no reason to be. He acknowledged the reality of what was happening and then he gave them something to hold on to. He told them that Captain Morrison knew exactly what he was doing, that the plane was built to fly and land on a single engine, and that what was happening was a controlled descent toward a runway where they would make an emergency landing, not a freefall. His voice was easy and natural, the way a person talks to someone they know well rather than the way an announcement sounds over a public address system. He told them what he needed from them. Stay in your seats. Listen to every instruction from the flight attendants. When they say brace, you brace. When they say put your head down, you do it without hesitation. He said he was going to stay on the microphone and talk them through the whole thing, that he was going to tell them exactly what to expect at every step so that nothing caught them off guard. He told them they were going to get through it together. Inside the cockpit, Captain Morrison's body language changed. The rigid, barely controlled tension in his shoulders eased just slightly. The panic that had been trying to take over his movements pulled back, and focus came back in to replace it. He could hear Elvis's voice filling the cabin behind him, and he could feel the atmosphere shift even from where he was sitting. He asked Elvis quietly, without taking his eyes off the instruments, whether he could see the passengers from where he was standing. Elvis leaned to look through the cockpit doorway. The screaming had stopped. People were still clearly terrified, but they were in their seats and they were listening. He told Morrison what he saw. Morrison told him they were starting their descent in 2 minutes and walked him through a list of things to tell the passengers, that the descent would feel steeper than what they were used to, that it was normal for an emergency approach, that they should take anything sharp out of their pockets, remove high-heeled shoes, and make sure nothing was left in the aisles. Elvis relayed all of it in the same calm and clear voice, breaking each piece of information down the way you would explain something step by step to a person who had never done it before, making it feel manageable rather than overwhelming. As the descent began, steeper and faster than a normal approach, Elvis kept talking. He told them about a time he had been frightened on a plane himself, turning it into a short, honest story that was both real and soothing at the same time. He described every sensation they were about to feel before they felt it, the pressure building in their ears, the sense of picking up speed, and then the thump of the landing gear deploying. When that thump came, he immediately got on the microphone and told them that the sound they had just heard was a good sound, that it was the wheels coming down, that it meant they were getting ready to touch ground. He told them that in about 3 minutes they were going to feel the wheels make contact with the runway, that the impact was going to be harder than any landing they had experienced before, that they would feel a sharp jolt, and that the jolt was actually a good thing because it meant they were back on solid earth. His voice did not shake once during any of it, even though his heart was hammering hard inside his chest and his back was soaked with cold sweat and he was every bit as frightened as the people he was talking to. In the final minute before touchdown he spoke more quietly and more personally. He told them that every single person on that plane mattered, that there were people waiting for each of them at home, and that they were going to make it back to those people. He said Captain Morrison had done everything right and that the landing was going to be hard but it was going to be safe, and that when it was over he wanted them to stay calm, wait for instructions from the crew, and help anyone around them who needed it. The plane hit the runway with a force that jolted everyone hard against their seatbelts exactly the way Elvis had told them it would. The brakes engaged with a sound like something tearing. The aircraft shuddered and bucked along the runway with emergency vehicles racing alongside it outside, and for several seconds that stretched out in a way that made them feel much longer, the plane continued down the strip before finally coming to a full and complete stop. The silence that followed lasted only a moment before someone started clapping. Then someone else joined in. Within seconds the entire cabin was applauding, with some people laughing and some crying, and all of them flooded with the kind of relief that only comes when something you thought might go terribly wrong does not. Elvis set the microphone down and stepped back from the cockpit. His legs were unsteady beneath him and his hands were trembling visibly. Now that the need to hold everything together was gone, his body was finally catching up with the terror he had been keeping pushed down for the last several minutes. Captain Morrison turned around in his seat, and Elvis could see tears on the young pilot's face. Morrison thanked him and said he did not know whether he could have managed it without Elvis keeping the passengers calm the way he did. Elvis told him that he was the one who had saved lives that day because he was the one who had landed the plane, and that all Elvis had done was talk. The co-pilot said quietly that talking was not all he had done, that he had given 80 frightened people something to focus on besides their own fear, and that he had given them hope when they had none, and that those things mattered in ways that were hard to fully measure. As the passengers evacuated down the emergency slides and ground crews moved in to check on everyone, Elvis tried to slip away without drawing attention to himself, but several people stopped him. They grabbed his hand or put their arms around him and thanked him with tears running down their faces. One man, a businessman who had been praying out loud during the worst of it, held Elvis's hand and told him he had been on planes easily 100 times in his life, and that if he ever found himself in a situation like that again, he would want Elvis on the flight. He told him what he had done was heroic. Elvis was visibly uncomfortable with the word and said it was not heroic, that he had just done what anyone would have done. The man told him firmly that was not true, that most people would have stayed in their seat and panicked right along with everyone else, and that choosing to get up and go help was exactly what made the difference. By the time Elvis finally got into the car the airline had arranged for him, the adrenaline was fading and the full weight of what had just happened was settling over him. When reporters later tried to get him to talk about the story, to let them write the headlines they wanted to write about Elvis saving the day, he refused consistently. He told them the captain and the crew were the ones who deserved the recognition because they were the ones who got the aircraft down safely. The airline offered him a formal award. He turned it down. They offered to fly him for free for the rest of his life. He told them that was not necessary. He wanted no part of the story being turned into something that was about him. But for the 80 people who had been on that plane, none of that mattered. The story did not go away for them. They told it to their families and their friends and their children and eventually their grandchildren. The story of the day Elvis Presley's voice had come through the speakers of a crippled aircraft and pulled them back from the edge of full panic and kept them steady until the wheels hit the ground. Captain Morrison went on to build a long and accomplished career as a pilot and handled many in-flight emergencies over the decades that followed. But he said consistently that the flight on March 17, 1969 had taught him the most important thing he ever learned in his entire career, which was that calm and steady leadership in a crisis is just as essential as technical skill, and that giving frightened people something concrete to focus on besides their fear can be the thing that determines whether a situation stays controlled or descends into chaos. He said in one interview that Elvis Presley probably did not even remember that flight or remember him, but that he remembered every detail of it, and that the presence of that one man in the cockpit doorway and the sound of that one voice in the cabin had made him a better pilot and helped him do what he needed to do that day. What the story of that flight in 1969 really comes down to is something straightforward and very human. Elvis did not have to get out of his seat. Nobody would have said a word if he had simply sat there and been just as frightened as everyone else, because everyone there had every reason to be frightened. But he looked around, saw what was needed, and went and did it using the only thing he had available to him in that moment, which was his voice and his ability to connect with people. He asked for no recognition for it, accepted none when it was offered, and walked away from it as quickly as he could. The people on that flight knew what had happened even if Elvis did not want to call it what it was. He had shown up in a moment that did not ask him to be famous or talented or larger than life. It just asked him to be a person willing to help, and that is exactly what he was.